Welcome to this week's Property Insider video. Today I'm going to have a chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson about what's happening in our property markets. We're also going to talk about the proposed stamp duty changes and who they're going to help in New South Wales. We'll take a look into Treasurer Josh Frydenberg's economic statement from last week and see if there's any good news amongst the doom and gloom. We'll look at the unemployment figures and what's happening with credit card spending. Are you spending more on your credit card? Now, if you want to keep up to date with the latest property data, why not subscribe to this channel so once a week when we have our regular Property Insider videos, you'll be informed. Especially if you click the little bell icon, YouTube will let you know when the latest episode is out. 2020 will be remembered for a myriad of challenges. We're at a precarious stage in this pandemic. Victoria's new daily infection numbers regularly are in the triple digits, and there's increasing reports of outbreaks in New South Wales. But amongst all these concerns, there's also some good news. There's the concerted and extraordinary international effort devoted to either a vaccine or a cure, a solution of some sort. And in Australia, there's also good news if you look for it. And that's what I want to discuss today in this week's Property Insider video with Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of myhousingmarket.com.au. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, we all love good news, don't we?
Well, we've got to look for it. Yes, we should. So I want to get an update on the market. And I'd also like to talk with you, if we could, about the proposed stamp duty changes in New South Wales, what we can read into last week's economic statement from Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, and maybe a bit about what's happening to unemployment and credit card use. So let's start off with, what are you finding happening in our property markets?
Well, as we've been saying for the past couple of months, Michael, property markets have perhaps surprised on the upside, particularly to those that forecasted doom and gloom. We shouldn't be surprised at that. But property markets continue to tick over. Sydney looks like still being the pick of all our capital city markets at the moment. We do look at those auction clearance rates, of course, every weekend. We have to take those with a grain of salt, as we have discussed. We are seeing a different auction model now reported, no doubt about that, in those Saturday results. We are seeing this hybrid online auction now being included as a typical auction. And what that means is we're getting higher levels of withdrawals from this hybrid auction marketing activity. And that, of course, pushes down the clearance rate. So we're not really comparing apples with apples anymore. But nonetheless, it does give us an interesting insight on a week-by-week basis. And Sydney clearance rates remain in the mid-60s to higher 60s. Withdrawals are higher than where they were a year ago, again reflecting that new marketing technique of the online auction. Melbourne, not surprisingly, those 40% clearance rates, again reflecting massive withdrawals. And that, of course, is a result of the closing down of the open-air auctions. Again, those people who have booked in an auction prior to the shutdown have withdrawn their property. Unsurprising, because we saw that back in April and May in similar circumstances. But nonetheless, the Sydney market continues to appeal. And even those low clearance rates did mask the fact that there were well over 100 sales reported in Melbourne on Saturday. Transactions are still occurring. Anecdotal results also coming through. I had a personal involvement with that, Michael, that a relative of mine was concerned. They had a property that was due to go to auction last Saturday, an outer eastern suburb of Melbourne, established outer eastern suburb. They were concerned with all the negative media that they wouldn't get a result on the day. They'd had some inspections, but the agent had reported no real interest. I said, look, no, you've got to go to auction. Please ignore the negativity that you're reading about, particularly the property market at the moment, because they wanted to just withdraw the property and not go ahead. So they went to auction, and guess what, Michael? It sold, and it sold above what I had as the median asking price for a property in that particular suburb. So they were thrilled, of course, but I said, well, look, at the end of the day, we have to really take a lot of what's discussed in the media with a grain of salt. It is chasing those clicks, as we all know, and the reality is that transactions are still occurring. Yes, listing numbers in Melbourne have fallen away, as we would expect, but they're still ahead of where they were, new listings coming through of where they were at the depth of the shutdown in April and May. And the other capital cities are really moving along quite nicely, Michael. And just as a finalisation to the market catch-up, I'm interestingly tracking some increase in the underlying median asking price of houses in Sydney. So it will be interesting to see when those monthly data sets come through next week to see whether we might have seen at least an easing in the rate of decline of prices in the Sydney market, which would certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons to those that have forecast catastrophic falls in house prices. If we actually got maybe by the end of the year a sense of higher prices, not lower prices. But you know, Michael, it's all deja vu, is it not? We don't have to go back too far to see this.
Been there before, haven't we?
Yeah,
Clearly, there isn't one Sydney market or Melbourne market, and so there are some segments that are suffering,
Oh,
including the
absolutely.
rental market and the
Yes,
high rise and the off the plan. But you're
yes.
right for houses. Yesterday, only last night, I know one of our buyers agents in Melbourne put an offer in on a villa unit. We were lucky enough to purchase it for our Brisbane client, but there were 5 offers below us. In other words, the agent asked for offers by 6 p.m. last night.
Yeah.
6 bidders for a good property. So
Yeah.
well-located properties are still selling well. But there's some incentives coming in the market. I know we've been talking about the government having to help the first home buyers in particular. And we know that the New South Wales government will temporarily add stamp duties on new homes. So it's only new homes for first home buyers. And they're hoping to boost the construction industry, create jobs and help first home buyers. Do you see that being an assistance to the property market, Andrew?
Absolutely, Michael, and we've discussed that. I'm a great supporter of fertilising property markets in times of economic stress by unleashing that pent-up demand that's always there from first home buyers. We saw first home buyers moving back into the market as prices increased last year. They were concerned that the prices growth would outstrip their capacity to save their deposit, because of course they don't have a trade-in. We had the first home buyer deposit scheme last year. Of course, that helped raise the number of first home buyers in the market, even though there was a 10,000 place cap on that. We've got that back now for this financial year, another 10,000. And of course, New South Wales government has announced an increase in the threshold for stamp duty relief for first home buyers. That was a real issue in Sydney, that the cut-off for the price that you were eligible for your full stamp duty discount, there weren't enough properties around because it had to be for new. So they've upped that now to $800,000 for the full stamp duty relief, which is good news and brings stamp first home buyers into the market. I still believe there's more work to be done, Michael, across the board. And that is that let's really start to think about also giving some relief from first home buyers who want to purchase in the established market. I think that clearly they need to get a little bit more of an economic insight into the capacity to drive improved economic activity by stimulating the established market. Because every time an established property is sold, of course, Michael, it's paid back downstream because another property then becomes a target for the seller. Sydney does have a problem in the sense that there aren't a lot of choices in new properties, and the new apartment market has issues in terms of the cost and the location of those relative to what first home buyers are looking for. So still some work to do, but good news for first home buyers, Michael.
Sure. Well, not every first home buyer wants to live in the outer suburbs or in a high-rise apartment.
We are seeing first home buyers buying established properties and foregoing the grant in New South Wales. So they're saying, well, we prefer an established property, even though we're not going to get the benefits attached to purchasing a new property.
Now, last week there was Josh Frydenberg's economic statement, and many people thought that would be a mini budget and they'd be announcing lots of things. There really wasn't much news there, and I guess we're going to have to wait for the October budget. But the media focused on the negatives. But I actually read some positives there. There was some good news. Various sectors of our economy are picking up. But what I also liked was that the Treasurer said our economy is going to contract by 3.75% in this calendar year. But only a couple of months ago, many experts were predicting our economy would plummet by 10%. And the Treasury dropped its forecast, suggesting that it's now been revised down. Won't be as bad a downturn as we expected.
Well, Michael, this is a sort of an interesting, I guess, focus on semantics. Is good news because it's better than the previous bad news? Or is it good news because it's good news, right? So we can't say that that what the Treasurer released in the mini statement last week is good news, but it is good news in relation, as you so rightly suggested, in relation to what was predicted previously. So I get into, people question me when I say, well, this was a good news story, particularly the unemployment figures. But it's a good news story, really, in the sense that the predictions that were made, and let's face it, Michael, some of the predictions that have been made and reported were absolutely outrageous in terms of where we were going. Yes, we didn't really know the depth of this particular pandemic and its impacts, but gee whiz, there's a lot of headline chasing in terms of predictions of 30% unemployment rates, just like we've had similar outrageous predictions in terms of price declines. But yes, I think there was good news because it wasn't as bad as the previous predictions. We are going to get an unemployment rate between 9 and 10% by the end of the year. May stabilise around there, but of course there's a lot of water to go under the bridge over the next few months, particularly given what's happening in Victoria. And the budget deficit, of course, is a big number, and a lot focused on that as being the negative point of the Treasurer's statement. But really, I think the really interesting news, Michael, is where our currency is at the moment. And I think that the world is giving Australia a big tick in terms of its economic outlook, its budgetary position compared to other established or advanced economies similar to Australia. And our dollar is now over 70 cents. It's risen quite sharply. Of course, the US dollar has fallen, so there's a bit of that involved. But I do think that the point is that our debt is rising at a lower rate than the debt of other advanced economies. And their deficits started at a much higher proportion than we did. We actually are starting this recovery environment from a position of a budget surplus, where we must remember that the US, by comparison, had a budget deficit of $1 trillion, which was 4% of its GDP. So that's why markets are giving Australia a tick, and that's why we shouldn't be focusing on this debt argument. The debt tide is rising right across the world, Michael, and with no interest rate energy to support economies, it is a debt market moving forward. And of course, the other interesting thing is there's plenty of money available to actually support debt at very low interest rates. So we shouldn't be too worried about the debt scenario. What we should worry about are jobs. That's the main game going forward. And the news is not good, but it's not as bad as it was.
Just getting back to your comment about the debt, the headline was the biggest deficit since World War II. But as you correctly say, at very low interest rates and also with a higher dollar. Now, in the old days when the dollar was high, Australians would love to travel overseas because they could spend more. But I read recently that last year Australia spent $65 billion on overseas vacations. This year, they're not going to be doing that. I assume they're going to be travelling locally if they can. And so a lot of that money is going to be spent boosting our local economy. And that's good news, Andrew. Tourism, recreation, experiences. People are going to want to spend their money to make up for the difficult challenges they've been having.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Michael. And we're already seeing that with the Queensland border reopened, that there's a lot of activity now from New South Wales, particularly moving into the holiday state we could call Queensland. And maybe that's the point, is that those that were going overseas will now look at destinations such as Queensland as an alternative. There are other sectors of the market, of the economy, Michael, that are doing very well. I think what was ignored also, the Prime Minister announced that our mining industry is booming now with iron ore and coal, particularly iron ore, at record levels, which is really good news, because even though it's not a great job creator, it does help us with our current account. And of course, that's what we need in a real sense in terms of being able to fund our debt going forward. It just makes it easier.
Another bit of good news this week is that the Commonwealth Bank showed that credit card spending is splurging. Now, I'm not saying it's good that people are spending on their credit cards, but it means the wheels of industry are still turning because people are getting $750 payments, government stimulus, JobKeeper. Others are in their jobs. Now, I guess more people are using credit cards because they can't go out and use cash. But even in Victoria, Andrew, where we are locked down, we're spending 5% more on credit cards last week than we did the same week last year. So people are still out there getting on with their lives.
Yeah, Michael, and it makes sense, of course, when you're in the lockdown environment. And it's also the online transactions are becoming such a force now. We are seeing commercial and personal transactions, purchases now very much focused on the online environment. And of course, that means credit card. And this is another, fillip for the cashless society, which is now it's like the work from home environment. The cashless society is now being pushed along by the shutdown from the coronavirus. But it'd be interesting to see where those interest rates are on credit cards at the moment, Michael. That was the plan on getting the Reserve Bank involved in bond purchases, pushed down the rates for credit cards and also for personal loans. I'm just wondering how that's working at the moment, Michael.
That's a good point. People should remember that the money on their credit cards isn't theirs. It's the bank's, and you're paying a privilege to
and
use
you pay for
it. Very much so. The last thing I'd like to quickly discuss is an update on employment or unemployment. The latest ABS data showed that jobs went down 1.1% between mid-June and mid-July. Clearly, Victoria suffered a bit more. That's not surprising. Where overall, the sort of services that were impacted the most industries were accommodation, food services, hospitality. None of that's really a surprise, Andrew.
No, Michael. And the latest figures from the monthly labour market ABS data we had a couple of surprises. My biggest surprise was that Queensland, the unemployment rate in Queensland actually fell over the month, and Brisbane was steady. And yet there was a lot who were predicting that because of the severe shutdown in Queensland, the impact on the tourist industry, that their unemployment rate would reflect that. But it hasn't to this point, which I think was quite interesting. It's still in the sevens, whereas South Australia and Western Australia are well into the eights. Sydney remains the leading economy in terms of the unemployment rate, but a lot of the work that's been recovered since the severe shutdown ended, has been for part-timers. We're still losing full-time jobs, Michael, but that's been taken up by a surge in part-time jobs coming back into the marketplace. And of course, that's not a surprise because that would be hospitality and tourism to a large degree.
Makes sense. So next week, we've got our monthly deep dive into the property market data. So I know you're going to be busy putting all that together. Look forward to catching up with you next week and hearing what's going on.
There might be some interesting results, Michael. So we wait with bated breath, do we not?
Yes. It'll defy some of the doomsayers.
Well, perhaps. Let's wait and see.
Okay. I look forward to it. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael.